The first rays of dawn crept through the custom-made blinds of the Rodriguez home, casting a golden amber light across the meticulously maintained living room. Derek Rodriguez stood motionless, a certified letter from the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association clutched in his trembling hands, his reflection ghosting against the perfectly cleaned windows. Oakwood Estates wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a carefully constructed ecosystem of conformity, where individuality was tolerated only in the most microscopic doses. Each home stood like a symmetrical soldier, lawns cut with military precision, mailboxes aligned with mathematical exactitude, and not a single decoration permitted without a triplicate form of approval. The letter before him was more than just a piece of paper. It was a declaration of war. $15,000 in accumulated fines. The number swam before his eyes, each digit a knife twisting deeper into his financial and emotional landscape. The infractions listed were so absurdly specific that they read like a Kafkaesque nightmare of suburban regulation. 1. Unauthorized wind chime, violation of sound ordinance and aesthetic uniformity. 2. Flower bed color exceeding approved palette. Pantone 11601 TCX bright white was the only acceptable variation. 3. Basketball hoop height exceeding community standard by 3.2 inches. 4. Outdoor furniture positioned at a 37-degree angle instead of the mandated 35-degree placement. 5. Garage door left open for 7 minutes and 23 seconds during non-approved maintenance hours. Derek's background in urban planning made these regulations particularly infuriating. He understood city planning, zoning laws, and community development. This wasn't planning. This was oppression disguised as community management. Maria Rodriguez, his wife, approached from behind. A corporate lawyer with a reputation for dismantling corporate legal defenses, she radiated a quiet, calculated energy. Her fingers brushed against the letter, her eyes scanning the document with the precision of a surgeon analyzing a complex medical chart. "They finally crossed the line," she said, her voice a controlled whisper that carried the weight of an incoming storm. Their journey to Oakwood Estates had been a dream of stability. 5 years ago, they had purchased a home believing it represented the pinnacle of suburban achievement. Derek, with his mixed Puerto Rican and Irish heritage, saw it as a testament to his family's hard-won success. Maria, whose parents had immigrated from Colombia and fought their way through systemic barriers, viewed the home as a symbol of their collective resilience. But the HOA had other plans. What began as minor disagreements had metamorphosed into a systematic campaign of harassment. Franklin Whitmore, the board president, was a retired mid-level corporate executive who had found his true calling in micromanaging the lives of his neighbors. A man who wore his power like an ill-fitting suit, constantly adjusting and readjusting to make himself feel more important. Derek walked to the garage, his sanctuary of creativity. Covered beneath a canvas tarp was his latest project, a wooden sculpture that violated approximately 17 separate HOA regulations. It wasn't just art. It was a manifesto of individual expression. Maria was already working, her laptop open, multiple browser tabs revealing a comprehensive research strategy. State laws, legal precedents, HOA regulations. She was building an arsenal of legal ammunition. "They want conformity," Derek muttered, more to himself than to Maria. She looked up, a dangerous smile playing on her lips. "They have no idea what's coming." Outside, Oakwood Estates looked picture-perfect. Identical houses lined immaculate streets. Mailboxes stood at attention. Not a single blade of grass dared to grow out of line. But beneath this pristine surface, a rebellion was about to ignite. The Rodriguez family wasn't just going to fight. They were going to redefine the very concept of community. The Oakwood Estates Community Center buzzed with an unusual tension on the night of the monthly HOA board meeting. Fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on rows of uncomfortable folding chairs, illuminating the faces of residents who had long suffered in silent submission. Tonight would be different. Maria Rodriguez adjusted her charcoal gray power suit, a deliberate choice of armor for the battle ahead. Each stitch, each perfectly pressed line seemed to whisper of the meticulous preparation that had gone into this moment. Her 3-ring binder, meticulously organized and color-coded, sat like a weapon of legal destruction on the table before her. Franklin Whitmore, the HOA board president, represented everything Maria despised about petty bureaucratic power. 62 years old, with a comb-over that fought a losing battle against male-pattern baldness and glasses that magnified his judgmental eyes, he epitomized the small-minded tyrant of suburban governance. The meeting room felt like a pressure cooker of suppressed frustrations. Residents who had previously only exchanged passive-aggressive glances now sat with a newfound sense of anticipation. Word had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The Rodriguez family was about to challenge the HOA in a way no one had dared before. "The chair recognizes Maria Rodriguez," Whitmore announced, his voice dripping with barely concealed contempt. Maria stood, her movements deliberate and controlled. She wasn't just presenting a case. She was conducting a surgical strike against years of systemic overreach. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice a perfect blend of professional courtesy and barely restrained fury, "I'm here to discuss the numerous legal violations in your recent actions against my family and, by extension, the residents of Oakwood Estates." What followed was nothing short of a legal masterpiece. Maria methodically dismantled the HOA's enforcement procedures with surgical precision. Each point was backed by meticulously researched documentation. 1. Procedural violations. She highlighted multiple instances where the HOA had failed to follow its own bylaws, including improper notice periods and inconsistent fine assessments. 2. Discriminatory enforcement. Through careful cross-referencing, Maria demonstrated a pattern of selective enforcement that disproportionately targeted specific homeowners. 3. Financial irregularities. Her most stunning revelation came from a forensic analysis of the HOA's financial records. Discrepancies emerged that suggested more than simple mismanagement. There were hints of potential embezzlement. Robert Stern, the HOA's longtime legal counsel, began to sweat visibly. His carefully pressed shirt suddenly looked rumpled, his confidence evaporating with each of Maria's carefully articulated points. The bombshell came when Maria produced documentation revealing that Franklin Whitmore himself had multiple unreported violations. An unauthorized gazebo that extended beyond approved property lines. Landscape lighting that exceeded community brightness standards. A home renovation completed without the required multiple approvals. The room fell into a stunned silence. Furthermore, Maria continued, sliding a thick document across the table, "I'm prepared to file a class action lawsuit representing homeowners who have been similarly harassed by overzealous enforcement." Her final move was strategic and devastating. She had already contacted local media, civil rights attorneys, and community activists. This was no longer just a dispute between one family and the HOA. It was becoming a referendum on homeowners' rights. Derek watched from the back of the room, a mix of pride and calculated anticipation etched on his face. Their years of careful preparation, of collecting every piece of documentation, of building a network of supportive neighbors, it was all culminating in this moment. Franklin Whitmore's hands trembled slightly as he shuffled through the documents. The power dynamic that had defined Oakwood Estates for decades was crumbling before his eyes. The rebellion had begun. The Rodriguez backyard had never been so alive. What started as a small gathering quickly transformed into a war room of suburban resistance. Folding chairs acquired from various neighbors created a makeshift council chamber, with strings of fairy lights casting a warm glow over maps, documents, and brewing discontent. Eleanor Martinez, a retired high school history teacher, arrived first. Her walker clicked against the concrete path, but her eyes burned with the fire of someone who had waited decades to fight back. Behind her came the Kaplan family, David, a software engineer, and his wife Rebecca, a local pediatric nurse, juggling their twin toddlers and a thick folder of HOA violation notices. "They fined us $500 because our children's chalk drawings were unauthorized street art," Rebecca muttered, her professional composure giving way to years of accumulated frustration. Derek Rodriguez moved between the gathering neighbors, serving homemade sangria and organizing the growing collection of documentation. Each story added another layer to their mounting case against the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. James Chin, a local architect, spread out a detailed map of the neighborhood. Colored pins marked each home that had faced what they now collectively recognized as systematic harassment. Red pins for serious violations, yellow for minor infractions, blue for potential legal challenges. "Look at this pattern," James explained, his professional precision cutting through the emotional tension. "It's not random. There's a deliberate strategy of targeting specific homeowners." The map told a story of systematic oppression. Families of color, young families, anyone who didn't fit the narrow definition of acceptable seemed to be disproportionately targeted. An elderly couple who had lived in their home for 40 years shared how they'd been fined for keeping a memorial garden for their late son, a garden that had been their source of healing for decades. Maria Rodriguez moved through the gathering like a general preparing for battle. Her laptop became a central command center, tracking every piece of evidence, every potential legal avenue. "We're not just fighting for ourselves," she announced to the growing group. "We're fighting for the very idea of community." The stories began to pour out. The Nguyens had been fined for keeping traditional Vietnamese wind chimes, a piece of cultural heritage deemed inappropriate by the HOA. The Williams family, an interracial couple, had faced repeated scrutiny over the most minute details of their home maintenance. Derek set up a massive whiteboard, dividing it into sections: legal challenges, community support, media strategy, personal stories. Each section quickly filled with notes, connections, possibilities. "We need to be strategic," Maria explained. "This isn't about winning a single battle. This is about fundamentally changing how HOAs operate." They created working groups. Eleanor Martinez would handle historical research, documenting the long-standing patterns of community control. David Kaplan would manage their digital strategy, creating a website and social media presence to share their stories. James Chen would provide expert testimony about urban planning and community design. As the night wore on, what had begun as a neighborhood gathering transformed into something more. This was a movement. Outside, Oakwood Estates looked the same: perfectly manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, houses standing like uniformed soldiers. But something had changed. The quiet streets now hummed with a different energy, the energy of resistance. Derek looked at Maria, a silent communication passing between them. They had started something that would be impossible to stop. The first true community meeting of the Oakwood Rebellion had begun. The silence in the Oakwood Estates courthouse was thick with anticipation. Sunlight streamed through historic windows, illuminating a room that had seen countless legal battles, but none quite like this. Maria Rodriguez sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture a perfect blend of professional composure and barely contained intensity. Beside her, Derek arranged a series of meticulously organized binders, each one a testament to their months of preparation. Behind them, the entire back row of the courtroom was filled with their neighbors, a silent army of support. The OA's counteroffensive had begun with a special hearing to force the Rodriguez family to comply with community standards or face foreclosure. What they hadn't anticipated was the level of preparation and resistance they would encounter. Franklin Whitmore sat across the room, his usual smugness replaced by a growing sense of unease. Robert Stern, the HOA's legal counsel, shuffled papers nervously, aware that this was no ordinary case. Maria's opening statement was a masterpiece of legal strategy. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and resolute, "this hearing is about more than a single family. This is about the fundamental rights of homeowners to maintain their property without fear of arbitrary and discriminatory enforcement." She systematically dismantled the HOA's case, presenting evidence that went far beyond the Rodriguez family's specific violations. 1. Discriminatory enforcement. Detailed documentation showing how HOA regulations were disproportionately applied to minority homeowners and families with children. 2. Financial irregularities. Forensic accounting that revealed questionable financial practices within the HOA board, including unexplained expenses and potential misappropriation of community funds. 3. Procedural violations. Comprehensive analysis of how the HOA consistently failed to follow its own bylaws and state regulations. Derek had spent countless nights helping Maria prepare. His background in urban planning provided crucial insights into community development and property rights. Each piece of evidence was carefully selected, each argument meticulously crafted. The turning point came when Maria introduced their key witness, Eleanor Martinez, the retired history teacher who had become a cornerstone of their resistance. Eleanor's testimony was devastating. With decades of community experience, she detailed the long-standing patterns of control and suppression within Oakwood Estates. She spoke of how the HOA had systematically discouraged diversity, creativity, and individual expression. "This isn't about maintaining community standards," Eleanor said, her voice steady and strong. "This is about maintaining a narrow, outdated vision of what a community should look like." Behind the scenes, Maria had been equally strategic. She had already contacted local media, civil rights attorneys, and community activists. What had begun as a local dispute was transforming into something much larger, a referendum on homeowners' rights and community governance. The HOA's lawyer, Robert Stern, attempted to counterattack. "The Rodriguez family has repeatedly violated clearly established community guidelines," he argued, his voice losing strength with each word. But Maria was prepared. For every accusation, she had documentation. For every claim, she had evidence. The Rodriguez family wasn't just defending themselves. They were challenging an entire system of suburban governance. As the hearing progressed, the mood in the courtroom shifted. What had begun as a routine legal proceeding was becoming something else entirely. A trial of the entire concept of HOA authority. Derek caught Maria's eye across the courtroom. A silent communication passed between them. They both knew this was about more than their home. This was about creating change. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of supporters had gathered. Neighbors who had long suffered in silence were now finding their voice. News cameras captured the growing movement, broadcasting their resistance to the entire community. The counteroffensive had begun. The newsroom of the Metro Chronicle buzzed with an electric energy that spoke of a story about to explode. Jessica Ramirez, the paper's most tenacious investigative reporter, spread her research across a wall of corkboards, red strings connecting photographs, documents, and handwritten notes. "This is more than just another HOA dispute," she muttered to her editor, Michael Jennings. The Rodriguez story had landed on their desk like a bombshell. What had begun as a local conflict was rapidly transforming into a national conversation about community governance, individual rights, and systemic oppression. Jessica's first interview with Maria Rodriguez had been revelatory. Instead of a simple homeowner complaint, she found a meticulously documented case of systematic harassment. The Rodriguez family had compiled an archive that would make most investigative journalists weep with joy. Every violation, every fine, every communication carefully preserved and annotated. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A whistleblower from within the Oakwood Estates HOA had reached out, providing a treasure trove of internal documents that suggested a pattern of behavior far more sinister than simple bureaucratic overreach. Email chains revealed a disturbing pattern of targeting specific homeowners. Coded language discussed ways to maintain the community's character, a thinly veiled euphemism for discrimination that dated back decades. Michael Jennings recognized the potential immediately. "This isn't just a local story," he told Jessica. "This is a national exposure." The first article hit the stands like a thunderbolt. Suburban Tire A&E. How one HOA became a case study in community oppression screamed the headline. The Metro Chronicle dedicated an entire special section to the Rodriguez family's fight, complete with historical context, legal analysis, and personal stories from other homeowners. Local news stations quickly picked up the story. Sarah Thompson, a veteran broadcast journalist, arrived in Oakwood Estates with her camera crew, capturing the growing community resistance. "David versus Goliath doesn't begin to describe what's happening here," Sarah reported, her voice carrying the weight of a breaking story. Her segment showed the human faces behind the legal battle: elderly couples, young families, immigrants, all united against a system that had long suppressed their voices. Social media exploded. The hashtag Oakwood Rebellion began trending nationally. Online communities of homeowners from across the country started sharing their own HOA horror stories. What had seemed like isolated incidents were now revealed as a widespread pattern of community control. Derek Rodriguez found himself at the center of a media storm he had never anticipated. Interviews, podcasts, news segments, their story was everywhere. But he and Maria remained focused. This was never about personal fame, but about challenging a broken system. The most surprising development came from unexpected allies. Urban planners, civil rights attorneys, and community activists began reaching out. The Rodriguez family had inadvertently created a blueprint for resistance. Franklin Whitmore, once the unquestioned ruler of Oakwood Estates, found himself increasingly isolated. Local media began digging into his background, uncovering a history of similar behavior in previous community positions. At a hastily called press conference, Whitmore attempted to defend the HOA's actions, but his carefully prepared statement crumbled under the weight of mounting evidence. Journalists asked pointed questions about discrimination, financial mismanagement, and systematic harassment. The story had become bigger than Oakwood Estates. It was now a national conversation about power, community, and the right to individual expression. As the sun set on another day of media coverage, Maria and Derek Rodriguez sat in their living room, surrounded by stacks of newspapers, interview requests, and support letters from across the country. The rebellion was no longer just theirs. It belonged to everyone. The county courthouse stood like a monument to justice, its limestone facade weathered by decades of legal battles. Inside, Courtroom A had never seen a case quite like the Rodriguez versus Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. Maria Rodriguez adjusted her blazer, a deep midnight blue that seemed to absorb the harsh fluorescent lighting. Her legal team surrounded her, a carefully assembled group of experts who represented more than just a single case. They were architects of systemic change. Judge Alina Rodriguez, no relation to Maria, but a first-generation American with her own history of fighting systemic barriers, presided over the courtroom. Her reputation for meticulous fairness preceded her. This was more than a simple property dispute. It was a referendum on community governance. The first expert witness was Dr. Amelia Chin, a renowned urban sociologist from Stanford University. Her testimony was a surgical deconstruction of HOA practices nationwide. Homeowners associations, she began, her voice clear and authoritative, have historically been tools of systemic exclusion. What began as community management mechanisms have become instruments of social control. Her presentation was devastating. Slides showed statistical evidence of discriminatory enforcement across multiple communities. Heat maps illustrated how HOA regulations disproportionately impacted minority homeowners, families with children, and those with lower incomes. James Carter, a civil rights attorney who had made his reputation challenging discriminatory housing practices, took the stand next. His testimony connected the Rodriguez case to broader patterns of community governance. This isn't about a wind chime or a basketball hoop, Carter argued. This is about the fundamental right of homeowners to exist authentically in their own spaces. The most shocking testimony came from an unexpected source. Robert Hernandez, a former HOA board member from a neighboring community, became a whistleblower. His detailed account revealed a culture of systematic harassment that extended far beyond Oakwood Estates. It was never about maintaining community standards. Hernandez testified, his voice breaking slightly. It was about maintaining a very narrow, very white, very affluent vision of what a neighborhood should look like. Derek Rodriguez watched from the gallery, surrounded by a growing community of supporters. Neighbors who had once been afraid now sat with their heads held high. The courtroom had become a catalyst for change. The HOA's legal team, led by the increasingly desperate Robert Stern, attempted to mount a defense, but each of their arguments was systematically dismantled by Maria's team. Financial records, internal communications, decades of documentation, each piece of evidence told a story of systematic oppression. Judge Alina Rodriguez listened intently, her face a careful mask of judicial neutrality. But those who knew her recognized the subtle signs of growing outrage. This was more than a legal proceeding. This was a moment of reckoning. During a break, Maria found a moment of quiet reflection. This battle was about more than their home. It was about reimagining community, about creating spaces where diversity was not just tolerated, but celebrated. The final day of testimony arrived with a sense of historic anticipation. The courtroom was packed, with overflow crowds watching via video feed. Journalists from national publications scribbled notes, sensing they were witnessing something momentous. As the closing arguments began, the air felt charged with possibility. The Rodriguez family had transformed a local dispute into a national conversation about power, community, and individual rights. Whatever the verdict, nothing would remain the same. The aftermath of the court proceedings reverberated through Oakwood Estates like a carefully orchestrated earthquake. Maria Rodriguez understood that true victory wasn't about winning a single battle, but about fundamentally restructuring the entire system. Her strategy was nothing short of brilliant. Using a complex network of contacts cultivated through years of legal work, Maria began a multi-pronged approach to dismantling the HOA's power structure. Each move was calculated, each decision a chess piece positioned with precision. The first target was Sarah Reynolds, the most persistent board member who had been digging into the Rodriguez family's background. Maria's contacts in corporate recruitment worked their magic. A dream job offer materialized, a senior compliance officer position in a Fortune 500 company, located 3 states away, with a compensation package that was almost impossible to refuse. Reynolds' departure created the first crack in the HOA's leadership. Simultaneously, Direct leveraged his urban planning connections. He initiated a comprehensive review of the neighborhood's bylaws, exposing numerous legal inconsistencies and potential violations of fair housing regulations. Each discovered irregularity was an additional nail in the HOA's coffin. The media attention had transformed their local dispute into a national conversation. Lawyers from civil rights organizations began reaching out, offering pro bono support and strategic guidance. What had started as a personal battle was now a blueprint for community resistance. Maria's most brilliant move came through financial channels. She identified and contacted several key investors and property management companies that had indirect financial stakes in Oakwood Estates. Strategic conversations revealed the potential financial risks of maintaining the current HOA structure. It's not just about legal liability, Maria would explain in her carefully measured tone. It's about long-term property values and community sustainability. The Whisper campaign worked brilliantly. Property values began to fluctuate. Potential buyers started asking uncomfortable questions. The HOA's board found themselves on the defensive, hemorrhaging support from within. Eleanor Martinez, the retired history teacher, played a crucial role. She began organizing community meetings, documenting the HOA's historical patterns of discrimination. Her meticulous research became a weapon more powerful than any legal brief. Derek's contribution was equally strategic. His urban planning expertise allowed him to draft alternative community governance models. These weren't just theoretical documents. They were comprehensive blueprints for more inclusive, democratic community management. The breaking point came unexpectedly. An internal whistleblower, someone within the HOA's inner circle, provided documentation that suggested years of financial mismanagement. Bank records, communication logs, budget discrepancies. The evidence was damning. Franklin Whitmore, the longtime HOA president, found himself increasingly isolated. Board members who had once supported him began to distance themselves. The network of power he had carefully constructed for decades began to crumble. Maria's legal team was relentless. They filed strategic lawsuits, submitted formal complaints, and ensured that every level of bureaucracy was aware of the HOA's systematic failures. Each filing was another blow to the organization's credibility. The community watched in a mix of anticipation and disbelief. Neighbors who had once been afraid to speak out now shared their stories openly. The Rodriguez family had given them a language of resistance, a blueprint for challenging systemic oppression. As the sun set on Oakwood Estates, the neighborhood looked the same. Perfectly manicured lawns, identical mailboxes. But everything had changed. The rebellion was winning, not through violence or pure confrontation, but through strategic, methodical deconstruction of an unjust system. 1 year after the initial confrontation, Oakwood Estates was unrecognizable. The community gathering in the newly renovated community center bore little resemblance to the rigid, controlled meetings of the past. Diverse faces filled the room: young families, retirees, professionals from various backgrounds, united by a shared vision of inclusive community governance. Maria Rodriguez stood at the podium, no longer as a challenger, but as the newly elected president of a completely redesigned community association. Behind her, a banner read Oakwood Estates, inclusive, equitable, united. The transformation had been comprehensive. Where once there were rigid, punitive regulations, now stood a collaborative approach to community management. The new bylaws, carefully crafted by Derek and a team of urban planners, urban sociologists, and community activists, represented a radical reimagining of neighborhood governance. Key changes included flexible landscaping guidelines that celebrated individual expression, a democratic review process for any community regulations, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all board members, transparent financial reporting, a community fund to support local initiatives and assist residents facing financial hardships. Eleanor Martinez, who had been instrumental in documenting the HOA's historical discriminatory practices, now served as the community's historical advisor. Her weekly workshops on community history and civic engagement had become a cornerstone of the neighborhood's new identity. The economic impact was equally remarkable. Property values had stabilized and begun to rise. What had once been a homogeneous, stagnant community was now a sought-after neighborhood known for its inclusivity and progressive approach. "This isn't just about winning a battle," Maria told the assembled residents. "This is about redefining what community means." Derek's urban planning background had proved crucial in reimagining the physical space of Oakwood Estates. Community gardens now replaced sterile, identical front yards. A network of shared spaces encouraged interaction and collaboration. Children's play areas, designed with input from residents of all ages, replaced the previously forbidden personal expressions. The most powerful transformation was cultural. Neighbors who had once viewed each other with suspicion now knew each other's names, shared meals, supported one another through challenges. The national media continued to follow their story. Oakwood Estates had become a case study in community transformation, featured in urban planning journals, sociology publications, and community development conferences. Franklin Whitmore, the former HOA president, had been completely ostracized. His attempts to challenge the new community structure had failed repeatedly, his network of influence dismantled by the very system he had once controlled. During a quiet moment, Maria and Derek reflected on their journey. What had begun as a personal fight against bureaucratic overreach had become a movement. "We didn't just change a neighborhood," Derek said, looking out over the community center filled with laughing, talking residents. "We showed what's possible when people truly work together." The Rodriguez family's rebellion had accomplished more than they could have imagined. They had created a blueprint for community transformation that was being studied and replicated in neighborhoods across the country. As the sun set on Oakwood Estates, the neighborhood glowed with a sense of possibility. The identical mailboxes and perfectly trimmed lawns remained, but now they were a choice, not a mandate. Each home told a story of individual expression, of community support, of hard-won victory. The rebellion was complete, but in many ways, it was just beginning.